Hi, and welcome to the National New Teacher Support Podcast, brought to you by New Teacher University. And today we have back with us a much awaited guest. This is their second appearance on the National New Teacher Support Podcast, and they're representing the League of Advocates, Dr. Allison Oliver and Dr. Pugh. We're so happy to have them back with us today. Our goal is to make sure that we help new teachers, not only with just instructional practices and pedagogy, but we help you to build those relationships through culture and climate that will help you just really strengthen the trust between you and your students, because your students won't care how much you know until they know how much you care, and they won't know how much you care until they feel that they can trust you. And today is Dr. Pugh and Dr. Oliver. They're going to talk with us about restorative practices. And I'm so happy to have them talk about that, because we can't always be punitive in our classrooms. We can't always be punitive to our students. We need to make sure that we are developing and that it's a process and that we are restoring those relationships and that they understand what community means. So today, Dr. Oliver, Dr. Pugh, if you all would just reintroduce yourselves to our audience in case they didn't catch the first podcast.
So I'm Dr. Christine Lewis Pugh, and I am currently an assistant professor at East Tennessee State University, teaching future school counselors and clinical mental health professionals just the ropes of being a wonderful counselor and understanding our role in the school and outside of the school.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hello, New Teacher University. I am Dr. Allison Oliver, and I bring you greetings from Austin Peay State University. I am currently an assistant professor in the Teaching and Learning Department, and my discipline is special education.
Well, thank you all so much. And I want our audience to know that you're not just listening to professors this evening, you're listening to practitioners. They've both been in the trenches, they've both been in the school system, making it happen, and they have receipts. So I want to thank you all again for coming today. And we're talking about restorative practices. What is restorative practices?
So when we look at restorative practice, we want to look at repairing the harm that may have been done, especially through the trauma lens, through processes. And we want to bring students and educators together so that we hold each other accountable and it's not punitive, but also allowing them to facilitate some dialogue about what happened so that we're not just handing down punishments, but we're able to discuss and students are able to see how whatever they have done has affected not only them, but those around them in a way that restores the relationships and keeps the relationship open, rather than being punitive and saying you did this and they don't have a voice in it. And so that is how I look at restorative practice, and Dr. O can add to that restorative lens, but I look at it through the lens of trauma.
Thank you.
Well, coming from Tennessee, she's on East Side and I'm West. We know that Tennessee Department of Education has adopted trauma-based standards across disciplines. So we can't negate not looking at trauma. But when I think about restorative practice, it is a rehabilitative state more so than a punitive state of mind. And we focus on the 5 R's. We focus on relationship building, respect giving, responsibility, repairing the relationship, and lastly, rehabilitating. We do a lot of currently K-12 school settings have predetermined consequences for everything. We took zero tolerance to a whole nother level when it was initially intended for just weapons and drugs. And now, minute infractions are turning into exclusionary discipline practices. So restorative practices just rehabilitates the student and staff alike.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when we're looking at restorative practices, these are practices that you would implement when students do something in the classroom that's against the classroom rules and procedures. Mm-hmm. And it can be from constant disruptions up to students having an altercation with each other.
Right.
And what I like about it is it doesn't, even if it's at the high end of an altercation, it does not always have to end with suspension or expulsion. And especially with our younger children, because we're in the process of teaching and developing those our younger children. So when we look at that, tells us what restorative practices, what they are. So what is it? When will we implement these practices, and how are they implemented?
So from my lens, from the school counseling lens, I always look at the why. When we talk about disruptive behaviors or disciplinary issues, we never really get down to what is actually going on behind the scenes or underneath the layers that we don't see. We just see the behavior itself. And so when I discuss it from this traumatic lens, we know that 1/3 of all children have experienced some level of trauma by the time they're 16 years old. And so once we know that, we understand what trauma is, and we know that we have to restore in the schools because students spend most of the majority of their day in a school setting. And so when these disciplinary infractions come out, understanding the why and how we implement it is going to be very important in how we implement the practices across the school and with our other professionals and educators within the building. And so when we look at anything that's been emotionally painful, distressful, with lasting mental health effects, because we also know that when we're not restorative and we have these punitive damages, we are grooming them to go into a world of, just not being able to express themselves, communicate, and like I say, leads back to depression, anxiety, and various different things. And so in order for us to implement these things, on my end, for the social emotional piece and the trauma lens, is to look at the why. What's behind this, that the reason why we need restorative practices to help understand and help many of our students have a voice, but also learn the words to use when they're frustrated, when they're upset, so it doesn't necessarily come out as something that a punitive consequence needs to come from, but maybe a discussion, or let's talk about what just happened. So they really gets in what's actually going on. And Dr. O can speak from the lens of disciplinary and special education students in that regard.
Okay, I just want to elevate a couple of things you said. You said that 1/3 of all children have experienced trauma by 16.
At the age of 16.
So that means at least 3 out of 10. If we have 20 children in a class, usually, which is a small class, 20 children, that means at least 6.5 of those students have experienced trauma.
Yes.
That's a large number. That's a large number. And when you think about that, I don't think about it. I think about it in terms of empathy for the children, but I also think about for that teacher who's not trained in mental health, but they're in there trying to teach, but they have all of these things continuing to bubble up in the classes. So that's a lot.
When I look at it, I'm not just looking from special education. I'm looking just in general for all students, because that's the misconception that students that have disabilities are the only ones experiencing trauma coming from those different backgrounds. We like to hone in on lower socioeconomic students have more traumatic experiences than, moderate middle class individuals. That's not the case anymore. Trauma does not hide from anyone. So when I look at it from academics, suspending a student, putting them in school suspension, puts them back for 1 day of lost instruction, puts them back forward. That's for a typical student. So when we look at bridging the gap with academics and behavior and relationships, if we keep employing these punitive practices, we're going to end up with a lot of students behind grade level, teachers frustrated. One thing that being a behavior specialist for the last 4.5 years, I focused on rehabilitating the staff member before I tried to rehabilitate the student. You can send a student to a school counselor, you can send them to mental health, but if the adults in the building do not know how to restore and rehabilitate and let things go, you're wasting time.
Absolutely.
So on the PD first.
Absolutely. Helping the adults to understand what restorative is, helping them to understand what letting go is, and really what healing the community is, because we are community leaders in our schools, and every teacher leads a community within that building. So it's very important that they know and understand that. So when we're looking at the restorative practice piece, how many people are involved in this? I know, let's say we have the child, we have the teacher. What else is involved in the process?
Everyone.
If it's like anybody with a vested interest in that child or in that school has a part in restorative practice. Like, we have to advocate. It's almost like you can't be the bystander. You can't wait for someone else to do it. You have to stand in and be the voice sometimes when we talk about these practices, because you may talk it, but you also have to walk it. And so you can't be punitive in one way and then say we're going to restore in another, because if you can't do both. I don't think these two live together. When you talk about restorative practice, you have to recognize, as Dr. Oliver spoke earlier, about what is your role as the adult. versus what the role is as a kid. And then you have to remember that the child has a voice.
Yes.
And so once we help them to understand what their role is and recognize that they have trauma too. So they're bringing their traumas in the room. The student has their trauma and what's going on with their whys. And then we have this clashing. And so when she talks about, you know, them not understanding and having those professional development, it's very important that they understand that we're still working with many humans. And so when you're working with that, they also have words, and we have to teach them to utilize those words in this practice so that we keep those lines of relationships positive and build those with whoever they can build it within the school.
And teaching them how to use those words, we have to give them the words.
Right.
Because oftentimes they don't have the words. That's why we hear so many other frustrations come out, because we don't have the language to express what we're experiencing or what we're feeling. And that's why it's so important that we have counselors in our building to teach our children those things. What are some strategies for implementing restorative practices? But before we get to that, you keep elevating child development. And that's really what it is. I've been using Chip Wood's book, Yardsticks, lately to speak with teachers and principals around, we are punishing children for being 11 years old. An 11-year-old, they're going to test limits. They're coming into new language. They're coming into new growth. Their bodies are developing, so they're confused. So there's just a number of things. They're argumentative. Mm-hmm. They like sarcasm given it, but they don't take it very well. So that's why it's important as adults that we know those things about child development, and we'll know not to be sarcastic with an 11-year-old when they're using sarcasm with us. We may ask them to explain themselves, because that always helps, because they may not hear what they're saying. So looking at that this is child development and through a trauma lens, I think that would help a lot of people. Another thing I've been sharing lately is a set of discipline data I was looking at. And I was able to look at it over a 3-month period, and I noticed around somewhere between the 20th and the 26th, a spike would begin. And then it would end right after the 1st of the month. And you look at what's happening during those times. Bills are due.
That's what lower socioeconomic status.
Absolutely. Evictions. I mean, you just have a number of things that's happening during that time that as adults, either some of us have forgotten or we've never had to experience, especially if, if we were born middle class and just never had to experience those things. So we really do have to understand that when we're punishing children, sometimes we are the second or third layer of punishment that they're getting from what life has already delivered before they got to us.
Their basic needs are not even being met yet. We're punishing them. A big thing as a behavior specialist I dealt with, and Dr. Pugh dealt with as a school counselor, after breaks of instruction, like coming back off Thanksgiving break, Christmas break, whereas we adults, because we enjoy our holiday time and we're not suffering to that extent, most of us, when they come back, you don't know what's going on during breaks. Some of them are not getting gifts. Some of them did not have a feast for Thanksgiving and were surrounded by families. And, they come back in pushing the gas to the pedal about academics. Nobody asks them, are they okay? We're talking about Thanksgiving dinner. Have we thought about, well, everybody didn't have a good holiday.
Absolutely.
That could bring up trauma in the classroom and bullying and different things. So just having an empathetic heart, and the basis of restorative practice, if we're honest, is dialogue.
Yes.
It's dialogue with stakeholders. If you take all the fancy stuff, it's understanding and talking to each other.
And we don't do enough of that. That's another conversation I've been having. If we want students to be able to read, we don't spend enough time reading. We spend more time with sheets about reading than we spend time reading. If we want them to be able to think, we need to think out loud, and that's talking. That's how you teach critical thinking. That's dialogue. That's us questioning, pushing, and probing. But we don't do enough of it. You get 3 or 4 exchanges, if that many. Maybe one student answer the question, and we'll kind of move on. And it's not that this is not a conviction against teachers, because teachers feel so pushed to cover the curriculum.
Right.
Until when you go into, I tell teachers when I'm observing them that I'm here to see what your students are doing. I want you to facilitate. So I try to take that off of them, that you're not on stage the whole time here. So you don't have to talk and try to get it all in. Whatever happens, that's what happens in the course of the lesson. Let's just make sure that we keep it research-based and keep it moving. So what are some strategies for restorative practices?
It depends on your setting. I hate to put a cookie cutter box with it, but it depends on your setting. But the first step is doing a needs assessment, seeing who you serve, seeing who's in your building. We do a lot of needs assessment with students. Again, who checks the staff? Who are you working with? Who do you have in your building that you're teaching, that's teaching these students? What are the administrators' backgrounds? It's been my experience, the more and more I read and research on disciplinary practices and behavior, because that's my jam, and it's not just special education, when you look at the data. So new teachers, the best advice for strategies for restorative practices is checking yourself and actually involving activities throughout the day, not only are just standards based, but reality based. We don't do enough relational activities with the lesson. You mentioned about reading. Yeah, we need to read the classics, but are we reading things that are going to advance these students as people?
Yes.
And I say for me, just talking about, just looking at the background once again, I said do a data dig. Not all of our schools are very diverse. And so when we say that, okay, we know brown boys and in education, they're more disproportionately given the punitive. But what about those schools that are predominantly? And so we have to actually look at what are our infractions and why is this so common? And then looking at our individual students. A lot of times our students and their discipline gets lost in the cracks because we just consider them a problem. Yes. And we don't go and consider that problem and provide resources. And so when we talk about that, you can have Dr. O in her classroom having some issues, but nobody comes to me and says, okay, you're having the same issues. There's a connection here. We're not talking amongst each other. We're talking about the same thing. A student can receive 3 write-ups from 3 different teachers. Not one time have those write-ups come together, but the administrator gets them and just punishes for the 3 write-ups and not say, these are connected. What is it? Or finding the one person that the student has a relationship with to make that relationship stronger, to see what more can we do. We see a relationship here, or there's a difference in this course. What is going on? Because the person that we actually leave out of this process and what restorative does is adds the student into the process. Yes. And we 9 times out of 10 just hand them down the sentence and says, this is your punishment. Let's call the parent. And they have no say. They didn't get a chance to respond. They didn't get the chance to say anything. And when they come back, we're like, will you do A, B, C, and D to be in our school? Because we're telling them it's a privilege to be here. And they don't see that.
Right.
Because it's not a privilege, and that goes back to when zero tolerance was enacted. Nobody likes to hear me say that, but the biggest problem are preconceived consequences. Yes. Students have no say in expectations, no say in how they're disciplined. Parents have no say. And when we look at all the evidence-based practices, everything shared within the public school sector should be stakeholder combined, shared, collaborative.
Yes. So I want to bring this down a level, because you all spoke from a school level and from a district level. If I'm a teacher and I just want to, in my classroom with my 25, 30, or 20 children, and I want to do restorative practices, what can I do inside my classroom that I can do that'll keep me from writing students up?
Centering.
Yes, I was going to say have those centering moments.
One thing we did was yoga, like yoga. You don't have to be a yoga instructor, but that was a part of their morning bell work every day. And discipline infractions went, whoop, and it didn't matter. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
What is centering?
Centering your minds, having routines, starting from a place of we call it a soft place to land. She probably has a clinical term for it, but centering for like most teachers, for the teachers I saw with implementation, it was just like the idea of the week. They would have a quote on the board, depending on the level of your students. In special education, it was just calming music, kind of to get your day started, because these students come to school with precipitating factors, things that are out beyond our control, and they just would center their mind on, we're here to work, here's the school day. And it would be a 10-minute yoga session with music playing. Sometimes it would be a written prompt where they could sit on the floor or lay out on the mats and journal. And you didn't have to tell the teacher what you journaled. But that's teaching academics, that's teaching mental health all in one. And it took less than 15 minutes.
Okay. And it's simply just that intrinsic motivation. What's motivating you today? And if nothing's, like we talked about the last time, one of the biggest things you can do is just have those open conversations, because you're also relationship building. We don't give opportunities to relationship build anymore. Students aren't as confident coming into classrooms anymore, thinking they can build a relationship with an adult. just maybe based on what they've experienced in the past, or just some experiences that they've had with their own adults in their personal lives. And so when we talk about what's motivating you, what motivates you to be here? And we know we're not all motivated every day because we sometimes struggle to get out of the bed. And so teachers have to also have those centering moments before they come and become with their classroom, because they also have to recognize they're just dealing with one individual, and the one person they can't control is themselves. And then they bring in 30 other smaller individuals where some may be able to articulate what's going on and others may not. How do I understand my student? And so when we talk about just in your classroom, asking yourself, who is your student, and getting to know them, because we also know that our first introduction to our students is always going to be surface level. So just because they wrote on a piece of paper that I am a part of this family, the more we have an opportunity to get to know them, the deeper they'll dive and let us know once they trust us. It's just like in counseling. Students won't tell you if they don't like you. And so the more they get to know you, the more they get to like you, the more they open up. And so you want to make sure you have those moments, like Dr. O said, to journal and to just take that small time to just focus on your student. Focus on them, focus on the practice, and let them have buy-in into the expectations of the class. You don't create the rules, they create what that looks like in the classroom.
So we've centered, we're 30 minutes into the class period, and like clockwork, every day, Terry starts to just talk out, disrupting the process. That's Terry thing. What can I do without writing Terry, or what type of restorative piece could I bring to Terry in that classroom that would engage the community?
Data collect, because she stated the why, the term in behavior is the function. You can only correct and modify behavior when you know the why or the function of the behavior. Every behavior has a function. Even anything we do have a function. Within those functions, everybody eats. You have escape mechanisms. The work may be too difficult, or they just don't feel like it. You have sensory needs. You have them trying to gain access to tangible items or favorable items. And then you just have them that wants your attention, whether that be negative or positive. Any behavior we do fits into those functions, those 4 functions.
So I'm Terry, show a new teacher how you would find out which one of those it is after you collect the data.
I would collect data using an ABC chart, antecedent, behavior, consequence. What happens before Terry gets riled up, and what do I do after? What happens before is going to help you understand the trigger and determine the function. And within those functions, there are different things that you can feed the function before it happens, and eventually it decreases drastically.
So you've done all of this without even talking to Terry. You kind of like figured this.
When I notice a pattern, yes. When I notice a pattern in the classroom, that's the first thing. The more versed new teachers get into it, you don't have to necessarily walk around with a clipboard or data collect, but you will see, you just gave me a pattern. 30 minutes in, does he need a movement break? What happened? Is the work getting hard? Once we do independent work, is that when the behavior is heightened? You develop patterns. The biggest barrier for new teachers to excel with their students academically and even behaviorally, they don't recognize patterns. And until you become versed in that, you have to use paper. You have to get somebody in there to observe. Sometimes you're the function, you're the problem.
Yes, I was about to say, because the teacher needs to be able to reflect on their patterns. Is it that 30 minutes into the class, I've run out of challenging work? Or am I talking too long? Am I lecturing too long? Just what is it? What am I doing? And so I like that, looking for patterns, because that's what life is. Life is math, and life is patterns. So if you're looking at the patterns, you're going to eventually solve the problem. Thank you so much for sharing that. What else would you all like to share with new teachers about restorative practices?
Advocate for it.
Yeah, I was going to say just that advocacy piece, because a lot of places and spaces say that we do this, and then when you don't see it or it becomes punitive, it's like, we had to, but did you? Do we really dig and say, could we have done something different? Because we don't like to be wrong. So sometimes we need to step back from what our idea of what's going on in our classroom before we make that write up and say, could I do something different? What role do I play in this? But a lot of times we don't think about that. It's like, give me the write up.
So what are the benefits for children when we use restorative practices?
No loss of instructional time.
I was going to say, yeah, no loss of instructional time, building relationships and building their confidence.
Social skills.
Confidence. Yes, the social skills, the confidence, and the idea that they can go on a trust. We tell students all the time, trust me, come talk to me. And then the first time they open up and talk to you, you either run in to go and let me go talk about this, or we didn't give them enough voice to help them understand and conceptualize and articulate what's actually going on. And so we have to remember we want to keep kids from shifting into survival mode. And so once we're punitive, they're in survival mode. So we're going to just strike back. When we're restorative, they're moving out of that survival because their brain function is saying, I got to survive. So however I got to do, so we learn to lie better. So if I know I'm always going to be punished for the same things, and sometimes I don't control what I do, this is my reaction because nobody's ever stopped to ask me why. I'm going to learn to survive. I'm going to learn how to get away with this a little bit better. But if someone stops and says, what's going on? I noticed this, like she said, the pattern in you. What can we do differently? I may change that one child's trajectory on how they respond and how they build a relationship with me so that we can avert some of those behaviors.
Absolutely.
Focus on the whole class at once. A big thing that I see with new teachers that have poor classroom management, start smaller because it becomes infectious. Behavior is infectious. And get a small group. Get the ones you know you can reach easy, early. And once they start seeing the incentives, the other ones will follow along. You can't change 30 students at once.
And we have to know that all of our students are different. And what they're bringing to the classroom is what they know. And if we punish children for being themselves, then we'll never get to that level of confidence. I'll never forget in a training one time, they talked about some children come from homes where there are maybe 2 children in the family, and Terry get a chance to talk, and then Bobby gets a chance to talk, and then this person talks. Then some children may come from home where there's an extended family in there, and if you don't jump in and say something, you don't get heard. And that's just kind of what they're used to, and teaching them how to do it in a setting. And we don't really stop and take time to teach that. We expect behavior, but we don't teach it. And that's really one difficult thing that we have with a lot of our children, especially in the schools, is that children are coming from all different homes, environment, cultures. And now we're bringing them in and saying, this is our culture. And we don't take a whole lot of time to teach it. We jump straight into academics, which oftentimes is not relevant to the children.
Can you reach into you?
Absolutely cannot reach them until you teach them. Thank you. That's a famous line from the last podcast, and I love it, love it, love it. We're going to keep it alive. So I want to thank you all for joining us again today with Restorative Practices. We want new teachers to know that your goal is to build relationships in the classroom. Your goal is to help students to develop children. So it's not an event. Nope. You can't have a character day and teach character and then move on with the year. Building relationships, restoring practices, and restoring relationships is an ongoing event.
It's a journey.
It's a process. It's definitely a journey. So we want to thank you all so much for joining us at New Teacher University on the National New Teacher Support Podcast. We really appreciate you all joining us. We're looking forward to you all coming again. I'm sure our new teachers are going to learn a lot from this and learning how to implement restorative practices, and just knowing what are restorative practices? How do we implement restorative practices? And when do we use them? So again, thank you, Dr. Oliver, and thank you, Dr. Pugh.
Thank you.
Thank you.